Number 16. The empty fishing grounds. Salt hangs in the air before the sun fully lifts over Bermagui. The shoreline is quiet. The cove is not. A boat sits abandoned and holed near what locals would later call Mystery Bay. Its cargo is scattered, as if the sea reached in and touched only what it wanted. 5 men had gone out on October 10, 1880. A government geologist, his assistant, and 3 local boatmen, and never came back. No bodies, no verified witness. Just the hard edge where land ends and the story breaks. On October 8, 1880, Lamont H.G. Young arrived at Bermagui by steamer with a practical assignment and no idea he was walking into one of Australia's oldest coastal mysteries. He was a geological surveyor for the Department of Mines, sent to inspect the Montreal gold diggings. That detail matters. This was not a pleasure outing or a loose fishing party drifting too far offshore. This was a government man on government business, in a settlement swollen with gold fever, where every track, boat, and conversation could carry money in it. By Sunday, October 10th, Young was in a boat with his assistant, Max Schneider, and 3 local men: Frank Lloyd, Bartholomew Casey, and Thomas Towers. 5 names, 5 adults. 1 short coastal trip, apparently to examine the shoreline around the field. Then the record goes thin. The boat believed to have carried them was later found holed and abandoned near the spot now tied to Mystery Bay. That hole changed everything. It meant the craft had not merely drifted away or slipped anchor. It suggested impact, sabotage, or a struggle serious enough to force the crew off course. Goldfield settlement, that possibility was more dangerous than an ordinary accident. A damaged boat near a mining route pointed not just to loss at sea, but to a scene where someone may have wanted something hidden. The cargo scattered aboard sharpened the problem. Supplies were not neatly lost to the tide. They were left in disorder, as if the boat had been abandoned in haste or searched before it was emptied. That contradiction matters because it narrows the innocent explanations. If the men had simply drowned, why was the boat still close enough to shore to be found, and why was its contents disturbed? If they had made land, where did 5 men go in a place that small? The evidence does not settle the case. It pushes it toward foul play without proving it. In a small coastal community, that gap becomes a furnace. Young was not just another missing man. He was a state geologist in the 1880s, part of the Geological Survey of New South Wales, working in a period when the expanding mining industry made every promising field politically valuable. So when 5 men vanished near a gold site, the event stopped being only local tragedy. It became economic anxiety. It became rumor with a payroll attached. And because there were no bodies, no verified final movements, and no clean explanation, the case had room to grow teeth. 7 years later, remains found near Bermagui were briefly linked to the missing party, but the long delay made that discovery almost useless. By then, salt, weather, and time had erased the details that might have confirmed identity. Contemporary reporting already treated the match as doubtful, and the uncertainty did more than weaken one theory. It deepened the whole mystery. If those remains were not theirs, the search had wasted 7 years chasing a false lead. If they were, the weight had stripped away the last chance to know how they died. Either way, the ocean still kept its secret. So the official story is a disappearance near a gold field, but the real tension is what the damaged boat implies. Something happened that was violent enough to hole the hull, dislodge the cargo, and leave the crew nowhere in sight. The boat may have belonged to them. It may not have. And if it did, then it is the only witness left, floating, broken, and still not even proven to be theirs. Number 15. The light went out. Everything was in order except the absence of the keepers. That is the shape of the record from Eileen Moore after the relief vessel reached the island on December 26, 1900. No final confession. No verified diary about men weeping in fear of a storm. Just a station on a black Atlantic rock in Scotland's Flannan Isles, and 3 men who were supposed to be there, but were not. Joseph Moore was the relieving keeper. He came aboard the lighthouse tender Hesperus, expecting routine. Land, climb, exchange places, begin another watch. But the landing was wrong from the start. No flag flew. No one waited at the crane. No one came down the path. Moore climbed to the light alone and opened a station that should have held 3 working men at the end of December. Instead, he found silence. The clock had stopped. The beds were unmade. The lamp had been prepared but unattended. The missing men had names, and that matters here because legend tends to blur them into characters. James Ducat, the principal keeper. Thomas Marshall, second assistant. Donald MacArthur, an occasional keeper filling in for the sick first assistant, William Ross. 3 lighthousemen on an island station that had only been operating since December 1899. Barely a year into service, and the light had already gone dark. One detail entered the story almost at once and never really left. An oilskin coat was missing. Not all of them. One. Somewhere between the empty interior and whatever happened outside, one keeper appears to have gone out without the full protection a December Atlantic demanded. Or else that detail hardened later into a hook the evidence cannot fully support. The case lives in the gap between what was seen and what was repeated. That is where ocean mysteries survive. When the clue is there, the timeline is there, but one link in the chain will not stay solid. 3 days later, on December 29th, Northern Lighthouse Board Superintendent Robert Muirhead arrived to inspect the island himself. His job was not folklore. It was to account for men, weather, damage, and procedure. So his report, dated January 8, 1901, matters more than the stories that came after it. What he found was not a sealed room impossibility. It was a work site after violence from the sea. Near the west landing, there was clear storm damage, broken railings, displaced equipment, and a rope box torn from its place. The rope box was reported about 110 feet above sea level. Ordinary waves should not have touched it. Extraordinary seas absolutely could. The public version turns the lighthouse into a locked stage set, where 3 keepers simply dissolved. But lighthouse routine was never meant to leave all 3 men exposed at once. Someone should have remained at the light. Someone should have been inside. The protected one, the witness, the survivor. Instead, there was no such man. Muirhead's conclusion was blunt. The keepers had likely gone down to secure equipment during bad weather and had been swept away. It is the most grounded explanation in the file, and it leaves the hardest human question unanswered. Why were all 3 outside? Ducat and Marshall, perhaps, but MacArthur too? Why leave the station together when the point of the station was continuity? The later myth tries to fill that gap with invented atmosphere, strange log entries, unnerved by impossible weather, a final ominous line before doom. But researchers who went back to the contemporary record found those famous details are not part of the firm evidence. The case became more supernatural as it moved farther away from 1900. The closer you get to the documents, the more concrete it becomes. A missed signal, an empty lighthouse, damaged gear, 3 absent bodies. That does not make it simple. The physical explanation creates its own jagged edge. A sea violent enough to rip hardware from stone and lift destruction more than 100 feet up a landing is believable on that coast. But procedure still matters. Men who lived by weather knew the danger better than anyone. So either the emergency below was urgent enough to draw them all out, or the final sequence happened in a narrower, messier burst than the report could reconstruct. One man goes down, another follows. A third runs out to help. That would fit the ocean's logic. It would also leave no witness at all. And the missing coat sits in the middle of that reconstruction like a loose bolt. If one keeper truly left without his oilskins, it suggests haste. Not a planned descent into heavy spray, but a sudden response. A shout, a slip, a crash below. But if that detail was embellished later, then one of the case's most quoted clues is not a clue at all. It is decoration attached after the fact. So the Flannan Isles disappearance is not really the story of a haunted lighthouse. It is the story of a documented scene with too little scene left in it. The records survive. The station records are now catalogued in Scotland under NLC 53. Muirhead's report survives. Moore's discovery survives. What does not survive is the last movement that would tell you why 3 trained men crossed the line between shelter and surf. The light failed. The station was empty. The west landing was wrecked. And when the search was over, there were still no bodies, no violence inside, and one reported oilskin coat missing. Number 14. The famous ghost ship. The ship that arrived with everything except the people. On December 4, 1872, a lookout aboard the brigantine De Gratia spotted a vessel in the Atlantic between the Azores and Portugal, moving the wrong way. It was not sinking. It was not dismasted. It was wandering under partial sail, yawing enough to look drunk from a distance. Captain David Morehouse raised his glass and recognized the lines at once. It was the Mary Celeste, an American brig that had left New York on November 7th for Genoa. She should have been far ahead. Instead, she was alone. A boarding party crossed over and found the image that would outlive the century. No captain, no crew, no Sarah Briggs, no 2-year-old Sophia Matilda. 10 people gone from a ship still afloat. On deck lay a sounding rod, the simple tool sailors used to measure water in the hold. Small thing, plain thing. On that ship, it may be the most human object of all. The myth came later, a supper still warm. Cups of tea on the table, panic frozen in place. Most of that was fiction. Some of it spread through retellings so successful they even blurred the ship's name into Mary Celeste. The real record is stranger because it is colder. Morehouse sailed the abandoned vessel into Gibraltar expecting a salvage award. Instead, he stepped into an admiralty proceeding. Testimony, inspection, suspicion. A formal court preserved, line by line, the contradiction that made the case famous. An intact vessel, but no witnesses left to explain it. Folklore can invent a ghost ship. A court record cannot. It can only pin down the facts that refuse to fit. Mary Celeste was seaworthy enough to be brought into port. Cargo of denatured alcohol was still largely aboard. Personal belongings remained. There was no sign of a fight, no massacre on deck, no pirate stripping of value. But the yawl was gone, along with the chronometer, the sextant, and the ship's papers. The last log entry was dated November 25th near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The ship gives two opposite messages at once. Someone left in an organized enough way to take the instruments needed for navigation. They also left a vessel that, by every ugly standard of the Atlantic, was still better shelter than an open boat. At that point, the story stops feeling like legend. It turns into a forensic problem. You are Benjamin Spooner Briggs now, 37 years old, experienced, religious, careful by reputation. Your wife and small daughter are aboard with you in rough, late autumn Atlantic weather. Winds had likely pushed above 35 knots before the final log entry. The sea is not calm. The decks are wet. The rig is working. Below you, one question matters more than any other. How much water is in the ship? So someone takes the sounding rod and checks the hold. But the ship carried another ingredient. More than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. Some of those barrels were later found empty. They were made of red oak, a wood more porous than the white oak often used for watertight casks. That does not prove an explosion. There was no burn damage, but alcohol vapor does not need flames to create terror. A sudden fume event, a pressure burst, a noise from below. Even the belief that the cargo might ignite could change the captain's math instantly. Not as an abstract risk, in minutes. Court in Gibraltar explored darker explanations because the scene invited them. Fraud, mutiny, murder for salvage money. None of them held. The evidence never settled into a crime. It settled into a decision. A bad one, perhaps fatal, but still a decision made by people who believed they were reacting to immediate danger. That makes the things left behind matter more. Clothing remained, money remained. Most of the cargo remained. If this was a deliberate disappearance, it was a bizarre one. If it was violence, it was tidy to the point of invisibility. If it was emergency abandonment, the missing yawl and instruments make immediate sense. You do not strip a ship. You leave fast, take what lets you navigate, and expect to come back when the danger passes. The ocean only had to break one link, not the ship. The last judgment. Maybe Briggs saw water where there should not have been water. Maybe the pumps seemed unreliable. Maybe a cargo scare convinced him the vessel was moments from blowing or foundering. A line may even have been rigged to keep the yawl tethered astern while the crew waited for the danger to clear. If that line parted in heavy weather, the distance between ship and boat would become final almost at once. Mary Celeste would keep sailing, lighter by 10 lives. So the famous ghost ship was never really a ghost story. It was a legal file attached to a vessel that should have had answers aboard and did not. An abandoned brig reached Gibraltar under her own canvas of evidence. The people who could read that evidence in real time were gone. sounding rod left on deck points to something smaller and more terrible than myth. A measurement, taken in bad light, that may have looked like doom. A crew thinking the ship was filling with dangerous water, even if the ship itself was not yet dying. Number 13. The Death Ship Broadcast. In the late 1940s, a distress call began to move from ship to ship across the Strait of Malacca. It was said to come from a Dutch freighter called the Orang Medan, and the message was already turning strange before anyone could verify where it came from. By the time the story hardened into legend, the radio had become the whole scene. Dead officers, a dead crew, and then the final broken transmission. I die. The SOS may have come from a ship no archive can find. The order here is backwards. The message comes first, the vessel comes second, and the evidence comes last, if it comes at all. In the common retelling, this happened in 1947 or 1948, when a nearby ship, usually named as the Silver Star, picked up the call and moved toward the source. The Orang Medan was drifting in one of the busiest sea lanes on Earth, the Strait of Malacca, where every hour brings another hull, another wake, another story that can vanish into traffic. The rescue crew boarded and found bodies scattered across the deck and bridge, eyes open, faces fixed in fear, even a dead dog lying among them. Then smoke began to rise from below. The boarders fled. The ship exploded and sank before anyone could really open it up. But the legend is strongest where the paperwork should be. By October 10, 1948, the story was already in print in the Albany Times, attributed to Elsevier's Weekly. By May 1952, it had crossed into the U.S. Coast Guard's Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council, which gave it an institutional echo that made the whole thing feel colder, more official, more real. A tale can survive a long time if it keeps changing hands in respectable rooms. It does not need a hull plate for that. It only needs repetition. And yet the ship itself refuses to appear. Researchers have searched Lloyd's Register and Dutch records and found no clean match for Orang Medan. No verified crew list has surfaced, no port record, no photograph, no wreck site. Even the name feels half right in a way legends often do, as if it was built to fit the map rather than the archive. Orang Medan is commonly translated as Man of Medan, a name that points toward North Sumatra and gives the ghost ship a geographic shadow. But a name that sounds local is not the same as a ship that sailed. The mystery narrows to a single, unstable point. The famous final radio message is everywhere, but its documented source is not. That instability changes the story completely. If the ship existed, then the question is, what happened aboard in the minutes before the signal died? Poison gas, fire, illegal cargo. Some hidden event that killed quickly and scared the rescuers away. Those theories fit the shape of the tale because they explain why a crew would be found dead and why the vessel would be abandoned in panic. But if the ship did not exist in the form the story claims, then the radio call becomes something else entirely. Not a clue from the sea. A clue about how the sea gets imagined. The post-war years were perfect soil for a story like this. Shipping lanes were crowded with military leftovers, black market cargo, chemical fears, and half-seen routes through Southeast Asia that ordinary people were never meant to understand. A ship with no clear records, a crew killed by something invisible, a rescue interrupted by flame. It all sounds like the kind of disaster that would hide itself inside the paperwork of the period. The horror feels practical. People keep retelling it because it sounds like a real maritime emergency that was simply too disturbing to preserve cleanly. But the deeper you go, the cleaner the wreck becomes. The strongest chain of evidence is not a deck log or a salvage report. It is a story chain. Newspaper to magazine to Coast Guard bulletin, each link making the last one look heavier than it was. That is how the Orang Medan survives. Not as a confirmed hull in a register, but as a distress signal with a perfect afterlife. The bodies are always there. The fire is always there. The rescue is always too late. The ship, somehow, is never where it should be. The broadcast is famous. The vessel behind it is still missing from the record. Number 12. The Unsinkable Drifter. At 5 a.m. on October 3, 1955, the MV Joyita slipped out of Apia, Western Samoa, bound for the Tokelau Islands with 25 people aboard, and only about 270 nautical miles to go. That is a 2-day run in calm conditions. It should have been routine. Instead, it became one of the Pacific's strangest abandonments. The ship itself made the mystery worse. Joyita was only 69 feet long, a compact trader, but she had been built with buoyant cork lining, the kind of construction that made her stubbornly hard to sink. She carried food, medical supplies, timber, and empty oil drums, cargo that says the ship was meant to keep moving, not vanish. The first problem is simple. If you are going to leave a vessel, you want to know it is dying. Joyita was not supposed to die easily. Captain Thomas H. Dusty Miller knew her well. He was a British-born skipper based in Samoa. By the time he pointed the bow north, he had 16 crew and 9 passengers under his command. No one set out that morning expecting drama. By the time the voyage should have ended, Joyita had stopped existing in the schedule. No arrival, no radio certainty, no bodies. Just open water and a missing ship. For weeks, searchers found nothing. Then, on November 10, 1955, the merchant vessel Tuvalu spotted her far west of the planned route, drifting near Fiji, north of Vanua Levu, roughly 600 miles off course. Not sunk, not torn apart, just there, listing heavily, partly flooded, with her radio damaged, her lifeboats gone, and her dinghy missing too. The deck still held blood-stained bandages and medical supplies. Some cargo was gone. Some navigational equipment had vanished. 25 people who had left Apia were nowhere to be seen. That discovery changes the scale of the case. This is no longer a small mistake in harbor. This is 25 people gone across a long stretch of the South Pacific, with a vessel that kept floating long after it should have been finished. The ocean did not swallow everything at once. It let the ship drift for 38 days, which only made the absence louder. And yet the central contradictions stayed untouched. In February 1956, an inquiry in Apia could explain flooding and mechanical trouble, but not why a cork-lined boat designed to resist sinking was abandoned in the first place. If Captain Miller thought Joyita was going down, he was making that call on a vessel built to stay alive longer than the people aboard her thought possible. Joyita refuses to settle into the usual shipwreck shape. The abandonment theory depends on panic, but panic needs a trigger. It needs water rising fast enough, smoke thick enough, or damage severe enough to make the sea look like the safer place. Yet the boat that should have been safer than the lifeboat was still there when the search ended. She was not a grave. She was a drifting contradiction, and the missing final step is still sitting inside that cork-lined hull. Number 11. 1 mile from shore. On December 22, 1967, the distress call came from water shallow enough to feel impossible. Dan Burak was off Miami in his 23-foot cabin cruiser Witchcraft, with Father Patrick Horgan aboard, watching the Christmas lights from the sea like it was going to be a brief, almost elegant run offshore. Then, about 9 p.m., Burak radioed the Coast Guard and said the boat had struck something underwater and needed a tow. Not a mayday, not a scream, just a calm request from a man whose boat had suddenly stopped behaving. Burak said Witchcraft was disabled, but not in immediate danger. The Coast Guard told him to fire a flare so they could find him faster. A rescue boat was already moving, and it reached the presumed position about 15 to 20 minutes later. But when it arrived, the scene was empty. No cruiser, no men, no flare in the dark, no debris in the water. Just a patch of ocean off Miami where a tow request had turned into silence. Some accounts place the boat near buoy number 7, close to Government Cut, less than a mile from shore. That is barely offshore by any standard, close enough that the city lights would still be behind you, close enough that help should not need long to find you. But Witchcraft was not found in that window, and because it was supposed to be so near land, the gap becomes harder to swallow, not easier. Witchcraft itself was only a 23-foot cabin cruiser, a small private boat, not some vast freighter lost beyond the horizon. Dan Burak was a Miami hotelier and yachtsman, the kind of man who would know these waters well enough to trust a quick evening outing. Patrick Horgan was with him, a Catholic priest along for what should have been a simple ride. The boat had even been described as having flotation features, the sort of detail that should have made sinking less likely, not more. And yet the search found nothing. By later summaries, the active hunt went on until around December 28th, 6 days after the disappearance. Boats and crews swept the area. The water gave back no body, no wreckage, No confirmed trace of either man. Just an empty radius where a distress call had been heard and answered too late. What makes witchcraft so unsettling is not only that it vanished, it is that the last known message sounded practical, controlled, almost routine. Barak did not seem to think he was dying. He sounded like a skipper trying to get a tow after a collision with something he could not see. That calm tone leaves almost no room for the rest of the story. If the boat was truly disabled but stable, where did it go in those 15 or 20 minutes? If it was not stable, why did the call sound like a minor problem instead of a final one? The common version says 1 mile offshore. The call says trouble, but not catastrophe. The rescue says no one was there when it arrived. The distance was short, the timeline was tight, and the sea still took both men before anyone could lay eyes on them. Witchcraft was not a wreck waiting to be found. It was a disappearance that happened after the boat sounded almost safe. Number 10. The Diamond Shoals Ghost. At dawn on January 31st, 1921, surfmen at Hatteras Inlet looked toward Diamond Shoals and saw a 5-masted schooner where no captain wanted to be, hard aground on the shifting bars off Cape Hatteras. Her spars were still up. Her hull showed through the winter surf. She was close enough to see, but not close enough to reach. Heavy seas kept the lifesavers back while the ship sat in plain sight, as if time had stopped around her. When men finally boarded her, the wreck was not the strangest part. The absence was. The crew was gone. The 2 lifeboats were gone. The logbook was gone. The navigation instruments were gone. Personal gear was gone too, taken by people who had apparently left in a hurry, yet still carried off exactly the things that could have explained where they thought they were going. The Carroll A. Deering had been built in 1919 at Bath, Maine. Only 2 years later, she was stranded on one of the most notorious patches of sand on the American coast. National Park Service summaries list the loss as 11 gone. Not drowned beside the ship, not recovered downstream, gone. 3 days earlier, on January 28th, the trail briefly goes warm. The Deering passed the Cape Lookout lightship off North Carolina, and Captain Jacobson later said a man aboard hailed him by megaphone. Not the captain, he thought. Another man. The message was simple enough to chill him. The ship had lost both anchors. But Jacobson saw more than the message. The deck looked wrong. Men were moving in a loose, unsettled way, too many of them visible at once. The kind of disorder that does not belong on a working schooner. It is not proof of trouble, only proof that something had already started to break. That detail matters because it turns the grounding into a contradiction. A ship can drift. A ship can lose anchors. A ship can even be abandoned. But if the crew had simply fled in panic, why did they take the log and instruments with them? And if they left in control of themselves, why did they leave behind a vessel that still looked usable, with food prepared in the galley as if the routine had not yet fully collapsed? The answer never settles cleanly. That is what makes the case cling. On the one hand, the Deering was a real ship in real weather, and Diamond Shoals could trap a vessel faster than pride or skill could save it. On the other hand, the timing refuses to line up neatly. Jacobson's sighting on January 28th suggests a crew still present and active. By January 31st, the ship is found alone, stripped of the very records that could anchor the final hours. That missing paperwork is not a decorative detail. It is the seam in the whole story. The logbook, charts, and instruments were not taken by accident, and they were not left to chance. Someone wanted the ship to speak less after they were gone. That choice makes every later theory harder, not easier. Mutiny, piracy, rum running, a hidden crime. None of it can be proved from the wreck alone, but the empty spaces aboard the Deering look less like a storm's after effect and more like a decision. Herbert Hoover, then U.S. Secretary of Commerce, took an interest, and speculation rushed in to fill the silence. Theories spread because the scene invited them. Another maritime disappearance, the steamer SS Hewitt, was dragged into the orbit of the case, as if one vanishing ship might explain another. Yet the Deering never needed legend to be unsettling. Its own evidence was enough. The crew left in boats, or they were put into boats. They carried away the items that would have told where the ship had been and where it had meant to go. Then they vanished so completely that no body, no verified lifeboat, and no clean chain of events ever came back to shore. The schooner itself did not survive long enough to answer back. It was later destroyed, taking the last physical witness with it. What remained was Jacobson's testimony, the report of lost anchors, and that empty ship with food waiting in the galley and no one left to eat it. And somewhere beyond Diamond Shoals, in the dark water between sighting and wreck, something still had to happen to the men who chose what to carry away. Number 9. The modern Mary Celeste. A lure hung from the stern. Hook, skirt, line. Nothing dramatic, nothing bloody, just a trolling rig left where someone had been using it very recently. On April 18, 2007, rescuers boarded the catamaran Cas 2 off Queensland. That small object was one of the coldest details on the boat. A lure in the water means a person was working near the water. And on this yacht, every clue pointed to activity that had stopped mid-motion. 33 to 40 feet, depending on the report. A modern cruising catamaran, not a wreck. 3 men were aboard when it left Airlie Beach on April 15th. Skipper Derek Batten, 56, Peter Tunstead, 69, and James Jim Tunstead, 63. They were sailing north along Australia's coast in calm enough conditions that later video from the vessel showed them relaxed on deck, smiling, moving around as if this was exactly what it seemed to be, an ordinary trip. By the time Coast Watch spotted Cas 2 near the Great Barrier Reef, roughly 88 nautical miles off Townsville in some accounts, one number had changed. 3 aboard had become 0 aboard. The boat was still there. The men were gone. Start with what remained. The engine was reported running. A laptop was on. Food was still aboard. Safety equipment had not been stripped out in panic. Personal belongings were where they should have been. One sail was badly damaged, but the vessel was not burned, looted, or smashed open. There were no obvious signs of violence. In older cases, the sea erases by force. Here, it barely disturbed the scene. Electronics, gear, power, hull, all of it stayed. Only the final human link was missing. This is what makes Cas 2 feel so modern and so vicious. Silence is easier to accept from a schooner in 1872. You can almost excuse it on a vessel with missing charts and a vanished logbook. But this was 2007. The boat had working systems. It had safety gear. Yet there was no final signal, no mayday, no confirmed distress call, no body. Cas 2 stands out because the scene looked interrupted. Look at the geometry investigators eventually favored. A catamaran does not have to race away from a swimmer to become unreachable. It only needs steerage, wind, or a little power. A person in the water suddenly faces a problem measured in seconds, not miles. No boarding ladder within reach. No one left aboard to circle back. The distance opens at once. A boat can drift away faster than a clothed adult can recover it, especially if that adult went in unexpectedly. In 2008, Queensland coroner Michael Barnes rejected piracy. He rejected elaborate disappearance stories. He proposed something smaller and more believable. One man may have gone overboard while trying to free a fishing line or check the propeller. The others entered the water to help. Then the yacht kept moving. The lure matters because it gives that theory a physical starting point. If a line fouls, someone goes aft. If it tangles near the propeller, someone may cut the engine or lean over to inspect. If the sea feels calm and safe, the first mistake becomes easier to make. One slip at the stern. One grab for a rail. One man in the water calling out. At that point, the other two are not making a careful decision. They are reacting. Picture the sequence in its ugliest form. First man falls while dealing with the lure or gear near the back of the boat. Another goes in to help, either by choice or because he loses balance reaching down. The third man is suddenly alone on deck with a moving vessel and 2 men in the water. He tries to stop the boat, or he jumps in too. The damaged sail fits a scramble. The running engine fits confusion. The lack of a radio call fits a crisis that did not begin as a crisis. It began as a routine fix beside the stern. People expect an ocean mystery to start with weather, impact, or violence. Cas 2 may have started with tackle, a hook in the wake, a line where it should not be, a propeller no one wanted fouled for long. By early May, the families called off the search. No survivors were found. No bodies were recovered. The official story could describe the chain of events, but it could never seal it shut. The boat was found. The ages, the route, the date, the systems, the deck video, the damaged sail, the open laptop, the food, the gear, all of that remained. What vanished was the one moment that would turn a plausible sequence into a proven one. Investigators may have come closest to that missing second not through the sail, or the engine, or the electronics, but through a single fishing lure still hanging over the stern, as if someone had just leaned down. Number 8. The Vanishing Patrol. On December 5, 1945, at about 2:10 p.m., 5 U.S. Navy TBM Avenger torpedo bombers lifted off from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale for a routine navigation exercise. Within hours, routine was gone. Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor led the flight, a combat pilot with enough experience to trust his own judgment and enough fuel to pay for one bad decision after another. The route looked simple. Fly east to Hen and Chicken Shoals, make a bombing run, continue out over the Atlantic, then turn north and southwest back to Florida. The first radio traffic already sounded wrong. Taylor reported that both compasses were acting up. Then came the confusion at the center of the case. Were they over the Florida Keys, the Bahamas, or open water east of the coast? Voices inside the formation seemed to think they should turn west toward land. Taylor was not sure west was safe. If he was farther south than he believed, west could pull them deeper into the Gulf instead of home. So the flight held course while the situation shifted beneath it. That is what bad navigation over water does. A correction can feel like rescue. The same correction can carry you farther away. The transmissions grew tighter as daylight faded. Weather moved in. Sea and sky began to merge. Fuel dropped minute by minute. In the radio logs, the men stopped sounding like a clean formation. They sound like people trying to agree on where the world is. One voice says one thing, another pushes back. Taylor keeps trying to steer through uncertainty with the tools he has. The problem is that the tools are no longer trustworthy. For featureless water, there is no road sign, no shoreline cue, no clean fix waiting ahead. Only distance. Only drift. Only a position nobody can prove. The exact location at the end matters, because every wrong turn changes the outcome. If Flight 19 was north of the Bahamas, west might have brought it toward Florida. If it was east of the coast, the same order could have pushed it farther into open ocean. If Taylor misread his position, then a reasonable correction may have lengthened the search path instead of shortening it. The radios preserve fragments of argument, but not the map that would settle them. They record confusion without the one coordinate that could confirm whether the last turn was a rescue attempt or a trap. Then the search began, and the loss doubled. A PBM Mariner seaplane, Training 49, was sent out to find the missing patrol. 13 men climbed aboard. It never came back. A possible mid-air explosion was later associated with its loss, but whatever happened out there turned one disappearance into two. The second loss made the first harder to close, because now the official story had to explain not just vanishing aircraft, but a rescue mission that may have failed catastrophically before it could report anything useful. Over the next 5 days, search crews scanned more than 250,000 square miles of Atlantic and Gulf waters, an area larger than many states, yet still too vast to pin down the final position of either flight. Ships, aircraft, and radio stations swept routes that could only guess at drift, fuel exhaustion, or a crash point already carried beyond the original track. Planes had broken up at sea. Currents could have scattered wreckage far from the impact. If they had stayed airborne longer than expected, the search window may already have been behind them. That is why the size of the search mattered less than its failure. Covering so much water still could not narrow the last known position enough to end the uncertainty. No wreckage from Flight 19, no confirmed trace of Training 49, no recovery to anchor the timeline and say where the patrol ended, where the rescue began, or why both disappeared into the same dark. The official records preserve the flight plan, the radio confusion, the search effort, and the loss. They do not preserve the final position. Without that position, the patrol's last turn cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The radios suggest doubt over direction and islands. The sea kept the answer just far enough out of reach, and the missing rescue plane may have been the clue that made the official explanation impossible to close. Number 7. The loneliest signal. In 1989, William A. Watkins was listening to Navy hydrophone tapes from the North Pacific when a whale call came through that did not belong to any known pattern. It carried the shape of a baleen whale song, but the strongest tone sat at 52 hertz, far above the 15 to 25 hertz range usually heard from blue and fin whales. The ocean had a voice on record, but no one had ever seen the singer. That mattered because the sound was not a one-off glitch. From 1992 onward, the same signal kept showing up season after season in the military-era SOSUS network, the underwater listening system the Navy had built for submarines. Across those recordings, the track moved through the North Pacific like a living route, off California, then north toward the Gulf of Alaska, the Aleutians, and Kodiak. Not a single photograph, not a single visual identification, just a recurring line of sound crossing a map no one could fully fill in. The call was not merely loud or deep or unusual in some vague way. It sat in a band that made sense for a baleen whale, but not for the species people compared it to. Blue whales and fin whales typically call much lower. This one sat higher, cleaner, and alone. So the question was never just, what whale makes that sound? The question was whether frequency alone could ever tell you who an animal is. You can hear how tempting the story becomes from there. One isolated voice, no companion track, no visual contact, a long ocean route with no body to match it. It is easy to turn that into loneliness. But the science is narrower than the legend. The recordings prove an anomalous caller. They do not prove emotion, not prove exile. They do not even prove a lone animal in the human sense, because hydrophones hear behavior, not biography. What they do prove is that something in the Pacific kept announcing itself in a register that did not line up neatly with the known whale catalog. The story survived because it started inside a military system built to catch submarines, not whales. Cold War hardware became an accidental biological archive. And in that archive, Watkins and his colleagues could follow one moving signature over years. The detections were strong enough to suggest persistence, but not strong enough to settle the identity. A malformed individual was possible. A hybrid was possible. An unusually vocal member of an unrecognized population was possible. A recording artifact was not a satisfying answer, because the pattern kept returning. So the mystery sharpened around absence. The ocean had left a trail, but only a trail. A frequency peak at 52 hertz. Seasonal movement across thousands of miles. A signal that could be tracked without ever being met. That creates a very specific kind of uncertainty, because the data tells you the voice existed, but not how to place it in the animal world with confidence. You are standing at the edge of that gap now. The hydrophone line is there, the migration is there, the call is there. But the creature itself never steps into the light. Scientists can infer range, timing, and vocal structure from frequency alone. They cannot infer a face, a name, or the private reason that voice kept traveling. It was a whale-like call without a known whale, and the sound on the tape was only the first thing the ocean refused to explain. Number 6. The sound too large. In the summer of 1997, NOAA was listening to an ocean larger than continents, not with ships scanning the surface, but with autonomous hydrophones spread across the Pacific. They were tied into a low-frequency system that had been in place since August 29, 1991. It was built to catch what human eyes never could: earthquakes, volcanoes, ruptures, pressure moving through black water. One of those signals did not arrive like a whale song. It arrived big enough to register on more than one sensor, big enough that distance became the first clue. Similar sounds in this system could travel more than 5,000 kilometers and still be heard. That is not a campfire story adjective, it is geometry. Something in the South Pacific had made a broadband sound so large that the ocean carried it across a huge section of the planet. At first glance, it seemed to do something stranger. It rose in frequency as it played out. It had a contour people associate with life, a call that swells, a voice that bends, an animal sound rather than a blunt mechanical hit. That gave the legend its oxygen. The noise was real. The profile felt biological. The source was not immediately traced to a ship, a bomb, or any known whale call. If every mystery leaves behind clues, this one left the most seductive kind, a sound that seemed to behave like a living thing. The public heard it in a form that made the myth stronger. The famous Bloop clip was not the raw event in real time. NOAA's released audio was sped up 16 times. In real time, this was an ultra-low frequency signal, closer to geophysics than to some cinematic roar from the deep. Once that accelerated version escaped into culture, people did what they always do with the ocean. They scaled the unknown upward. The noise that made people imagine an animal the size of a continent got its name in that gap between a graph and an imagination. The myth took shape fast. Maybe it was a creature too large to classify. Maybe it lived far below the range of ordinary surveys. Maybe the ocean had produced a body without producing a sighting. The source region sat in the South Pacific, one of the least forgiving expanses on Earth, and the lack of a visual answer only helped. The logic tightened. If it sounded alive and no known animal matched it, then perhaps the animal was unknown. The evidence did not stop in 1997. NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory kept listening. For years. Not to fantasies, but to repeatable, low-frequency events. In the Scotia Sea and around Antarctica, the hydrophones began catching cryogenic signals from ice. Icebergs cracking, grinding, calving, splitting under stress. Some of them spread across the same vast distances. Some carried broadband energy across ranges above 5,000 kilometers. Some produced spectrograms that looked uncomfortably familiar. The shape that had sounded biological had a rival explanation, and it was colder than anyone wanted. Later Antarctic ice quakes generated patterns similar to the 1997 event. Not identical in the neat storybook sense, similar in the way forensic matches usually work. Enough overlap in structure, duration, and frequency behavior to move the case out of zoology and into glaciology. NOAA eventually described the bloop as consistent with ice quakes, probably from iceberg activity somewhere between the Bransfield Strait and the Ross Sea, or possibly near Cape Adare. That matters because ice can imitate life surprisingly well when you only hear the aftermath. A large iceberg does not break once. It fractures, grinds, sheds, resonates. One comparable broadband calving signal spans roughly 1 to 440 hertz. That sits low, below the dramatic register people imagine, but it is perfect for long-distance travel through seawater. The ocean preserves low-frequency energy very well. A source does not need to be monstrous. It needs to be loud, cold, and far away. There was even a later demonstration of what this kind of listening could do. In early 2008, NOAA used icequake signals to acoustically track iceberg A53A as it disintegrated near South Georgia Island. By then, the method had teeth. Scientists were not guessing that ice could make ocean-spanning noise. They were following a breaking iceberg through sound. So was the bloop solved? The creature was. The original monster story does not survive the later evidence. The best supported answer is ice, not biology. But the event that produced the 1997 signal was never tied to one photographed iceberg, one exact fracture line, one logged breakup with a timestamp and a clean visual confirmation. The source was narrowed to a broad Antarctic arrival region, not pinned to a single named moment. Officially, it is consistent with an icequake from the Antarctic region. In popular culture, it stayed something else. A sped-up 1997 sound that seemed alive, with no exact iceberg ever identified. Number 5. The repeating signal. The signal that keeps coming back without an address. On August 29, 1991, engineers at NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory switched on their first civilian acquisition system for the Navy's SOSUS hydrophones. These cables had been built to hear submarines across entire ocean basins. Instead, almost immediately, they caught something that did not belong to the normal ledger of ships, whales, storms, or earthquakes. A long train of narrow-band tones that rose in frequency over several seconds, then did it again and again. NOAA gave it a plain name: upsweep. Start with the pattern. Not one blast, not one collapse. A repeated signal. Strong enough to be recorded throughout the Pacific. Located, at least approximately, near 54 degrees south, 140 degrees west, deep in the South Pacific and far from any ordinary witness. It seemed to peak around spring and fall. That matters because repetition changes the kind of mystery this is. A single ocean sound can be almost anything, once. A sound that returns with a rough season begins to look less like an animal attack, less like some one-off mechanical failure, and more like a system. But the numbers refuse to sit still. Each pulse lasts several seconds, which is too long for a random click, and too clean for the acoustic debris field you would expect from a chaotic rupture. The signal is narrowband, meaning its energy sits in a relatively tight frequency range instead of splashing across everything. That is not how the classic sea monster imagination works. Monsters thrash, ships groan, explosions bloom wide. Sweep climbs in a disciplined line, like an instrument being struck the same way over and over from somewhere beyond the horizon. So the first suspects get thinned out fast. Whales produce patterned calls, but this did not fit the usual catalog. Surface weather makes noise, but weather noise is broader and messier. Ships leave signatures, but they move, and moving sources draw tracks through time. Upsweep acted anchored. Not visible, not named. Anchored in behavior. Analysts pushed the source toward a remote volcanic region in the South Pacific, an area of inferred seismicity. If the source is volcanic or hydrothermal, the repetition starts to make sense. Submarine geology does not fail only once. It vents, cracks, shifts pressure, and releases energy in episodes. But that same explanation creates a narrower problem. Volcanoes and quakes usually advertise themselves with broadband violence. Upsweep did something tidier. It arrived as repeated, rising bands, almost as if the ocean were hearing only one narrow slice of a larger event. NOAA noted that the spring and fall peaks might not belong to the source itself. They may belong to the route. Sound in the ocean does not travel through a fixed hallway. Temperature layers shift. Pressure profiles change. Seasonal structure bends acoustic energy, strengthens it, weakens it, edits it before it reaches a hydrophone thousands of miles away. So when listeners heard Upsweep return on a schedule, they may have been hearing not just a cyclic source, but a cyclic ocean. You can feel the trap there. The clue exists. The timeline exists. The return pattern exists. One link in the chain may already be gone before the signal reaches the instrument. The event at 54 South, 140 West might not be what the hydrophones heard. It might have been what remained after the Pacific filtered it. Then another number starts leaning on the case. Since 1991, the overall source level has declined steadily. If this were an undiscovered giant animal, the trend would be bizarre. If it were shipping, the persistence and location would be wrong. If it were a single catastrophic rupture, it should have ended. But a geologic or hydrothermal system can fade. Pressure changes, fractures seal, activity migrates, a vent field cools. The machinery under the seafloor keeps operating, just less loudly than before. Upsweep sits in a very specific category of ocean mystery. Repetition helps. It cuts away the dramatic nonsense. A seasonal, decades-long basin-scale signal is terrible evidence for a lurking beast. It is much better evidence for a physical process in a fixed region. So the old monster answer does not survive contact with the record. Scientists can say what family of cause fits best. They still cannot point to the exact source mechanism and say, there, that fracture, that vent, that one volcanic process on that one piece of seafloor. Decades later, NOAA still detects upsweep on equatorial autonomous hydrophone arrays. The signal that once stood out in the early 1990s still comes back, fainter than before, from the direction of a remote volcanic province. Seasonal repetition ruled out the creature story. It did not produce a confirmed source. The file still ends with the same coordinates, 54 degrees south, 140 degrees west. Number 4. The bodies without names. A white mass lies on black rock in Bermuda surf. No head, no eyes. No bones pushing through skin, just wet, fibrous tissue, pale as boiled rubber, folding in on itself every time a wave hits it. From a distance, it looks less like something dead than something unfinished. In May 1988, fisherman and diver Teddy Tucker was called to Bermuda's south shore to look at exactly that. The press gave it a perfect tabloid name, the corpse that looked more wrong the longer it decomposed. Globsters do that. They arrive huge and broken, and the ocean has already stripped away the parts that would let you name them. The public sees a monster. Scientists inherit a forensic scene with most of the labels torn off. That mattered more than it seemed, because once the wrong identity takes hold on a beach, it can harden into a record that lasts for decades. Tucker had spent years around wrecks and marine life. This thing still stopped people cold. It was described as a giant white blob, rubbery, featureless, carcass-like. No obvious limbs, no visible skull, no clean set of teeth to point at. Bermuda made the scene worse in the best possible way. Deep Atlantic water sits close offshore, so once speculation started, giant squid was almost inevitable. If something impossible was going to drift in from the dark, this felt like the place. Government fisheries scientist Dr. Wolfgang Sterer examined it too. Examination is not instant identification. A carcass in advanced decay does not politely keep the features a field guide needs. Waves tear it open. Scavengers take what they can. Skin slips away. Early reporting left room. Maybe shark, maybe fish, maybe something stranger. Officially, there was caution. In public, caution lasts about 5 minutes when a sea monster is on the beach, and every hour without a firm answer gives the myth more room to grow. This was not a new pattern. 92 years earlier, in 1896, another famous mass had washed ashore near St. Augustine, Florida. It too looked wrong enough to escape easy classification. Then came the escalation that made later cases harder to kill. Yale zoologist A.E. Verrill suggested it might be a gigantic octopus. That single date gave the monster story academic permission. Not a sailor's tale, not a tourist invention. A real zoologist, with a real name, attaching a real possibility to an impossible carcass. By the time Bermuda got its blob in 1988, the script was already waiting. White tissue, missing anatomy, newspapers. Then the old dream returns from storage. Maybe one of the monsters was real after all. You can feel why that idea survives. You are standing on a shoreline, looking at something larger than a person, softer than meat, stringier than blubber, and less recognizable the closer you get. If this were a whale, where is the whale shape? Where is the jaw? Where are the flippers? Where are the ribs? A known animal is supposed to become more familiar as you inspect it. These things do the opposite. And that reversal has consequences. Each famous mistake becomes evidence for the next one. So the case moved, slowly, from folklore to tissue science. In 1995, Sidney K. Pierce, G.M. Smith, T.K. Mogul, and E.W. Clark published a study titled On the Giant Octopus and the Bermuda Blob. The important part was not the citation. It was the confrontation. Beach story entered the microscope, and the microscope could only work with what decay had failed to erase. Samples from the Bermuda material were examined alongside tissue from the old St. Augustine specimen. Not sketches, not eyewitness memory. Actual structure, cut thin enough to test whether the monster had ever possessed the anatomy people were imagining. The result was not tentacle anatomy. It was collagen. That word changes the whole image. Under magnification, the tissue did not resolve into suckers, muscle bands, or any organized cephalopod structure. The microscope did not reveal hidden octopus detail. It destroyed that hope. What remained was the tough, stringy framework that can outlast almost everything else in a whale carcass, and then wash ashore looking horribly deliberate. Ropes, sheets, and frayed white masses that seemed designed rather than shredded. The absence mattered as much as the presence. No tentacle structure meant the most famous interpretation was not merely unproven, it was anatomically unsupported. The evidence kept tightening, but the story also got messier. In 1997, another Bermuda blob entered the record and was later identified as whale adipose tissue. In retellings, separate carcasses began collapsing into one legend, as if every white mass on a Bermudian shore were a chapter in the same monster's biography. That blending helped create a durable false record. Different dates, different remains, different identifications, all fused into one stronger myth. Then 2004 raised the pressure again. Further molecular work on globster samples, including the so-called Chilean blob and other famous remains, pointed back to whale tissue. Because the ocean had finally become generous with evidence, but because enough of the ordinary animals still survived in the wreckage to identify it after the spectacle had already spread. Case after case suggested the same ugly pattern. Not unknown leviathans surfacing from the abyss, but familiar bodies transformed into unrecognizable props by salt, surf, scavengers, and time. That is why globster stories endure. Sea monster found on shore is simple. The correction arrives later, fragmented, and often after the physical proof has been cut up, sampled, hauled away, or destroyed by the same sea that made it look uncanny in the first place. Officially, the Bermuda blob became less mysterious. On paper, the monster shrank into tissue classification. But that resolution carries its own unease, because the ocean solves these cases by erasing them. And if it removes the very structures needed to prove an ordinary origin, how many beach monsters entered the record under the wrong name and stayed there? Number 3. The monster that became chemistry. By the time the answer arrived, the monster had already won. On Panuno Beach near Los Muermos, in southern Chile, a pale mass nearly 12 meters long lay collapsing under cold air, salt, and cameras. It sat there for weeks. There was no obvious skull, no clean rib cage, no neat row of vertebrae to announce what it had been. Just a sagging, gelatinous body on the sand in July 2003. The kind of thing that looks as if it came from a place biology forgot. That missing structure set the trap. People recognize animals by hard parts, teeth, bones, limbs. Strip those away, leave swollen tissue and ropes of fiber. The ocean can turn something familiar into evidence no one trusts. The clue is still there. The timeline is still there. But the clue survives in the least readable form possible. Early reports went where you would expect. Whale blubber, maybe. A giant octopus, maybe. Maybe something stranger. The body had degraded so badly that shape had stopped being useful evidence. After about 3 weeks on shore, it was less a carcass than what a carcass leaves behind. Soft tissue had slumped, surfaces had torn, scavengers and decay had erased the features people instinctively rely on. By July 12, 2003, Chilean experts were already pulling the case back from folklore and into anatomy. Investigators at the Museum of Natural History in Santiago examined the remains and reported structures consistent with sperm whale tissue, including dermal glands. That mattered. Glands do not care what a silhouette looks like from 30 feet away. They belong to bodies, not rumors. The sea monster disappeared under a microscope. The image everyone remembered came from the beach. One huge, boneless-looking thing, too degraded to read at a glance. The formal study moved the case into a different world. Not eyewitness shock, not tabloid comparisons. Tissue, chemistry, amplification, sequence. Researchers found that the mass was made largely of collagen-rich material, the kind of structural protein expected in mammalian connective tissue. They identified biochemical markers including glycine, hydroxyproline, and hydroxylysine. Dry words, but devastating ones. Those molecules did not make the carcass less dramatic. They made it specific. They showed that this was not an unknown animal hiding its identity. It was known tissue, still present after the rest of that identity had been stripped away. Then came the molecular proof. The later paper reported an 800 base pair PCR product from the sample. Its sequence was 100% identical to sperm whale NAD2. Not close, not suggestive, not possibly related. A full match to Physeter catodon, the sperm whale. What washed ashore looked wrong because most of what remained was the blubber layer of a sperm whale, altered by decomposition until it no longer resembled an animal assembled in the usual way. Heat, bacteria, scavengers, and open water had done their work. Softer internal structures broke down. Distinct outlines vanished. Fibrous collagen stayed behind. Sperm whales also carry immense volumes of specialized tissue in the head, including the spermaceti organ. A carcass can keep bulk long after the parts people expect to see have been lost or separated. What you are seeing is mass without a readable blueprint. Weight without a face. That's what makes the beach specimens so deceptive. It seemed boneless, almost structureless, and therefore alien. But boneless never meant not a whale. It meant the chain of recognition had snapped at the exact point where most people usually solve the puzzle. The ocean removed one link and left the rest behind. There is a small wrinkle in the record. Contemporary reporting suggested gross anatomy in Santiago was enough for the initial identification. The later study supplied the DNA confirmation that locked it down. Certainty arrived in layers. First trained eyes, then chemistry, then sequence. Every layer pointed the same way. The mystery did not collapse because the beach scene became easier to read. It collapsed because the evidence got smaller. This case belongs here for a different reason. Not because the Chilean blob stayed unsolved, but because for a while it looked unsolvable in the most convincing way possible. The timeline was there. The object was there. The photographs were there. Yet the answer hid inside material so degraded that the truth had to be pulled from fibers and molecules after the spectacle had already spread worldwide. On the sand, it looked like a creature with no bones and no name. Under the microscope, it turned into glands, collagen, and a sequence match. Strand by strand, the monster thinned out. What remained on the beach was whale tissue, holding its shape a little longer in the cold Chilean air. Number 2. The missing island. The island vanished just when it became valuable. In 1997, a Mexican Navy oceanographic vessel went looking for a piece of land that could shift a national border at sea. Bermeja was just a name on old charts in the Gulf of Mexico, but if it sat where the maps said it did, a barely visible point of land could push maritime lines far beyond its size. Mexico was not chasing scenery. It was chasing a coordinate that might matter in later boundary talks with the United States. And with those lines came access, leverage, and resources. When the ship reached the area, there was no island there at all. Land is supposed to be the stable part. Water moves, currents move, borders on paper move. An island should be the thing that stays put long enough to be found again. Bermeja's paper life begins in the 16th century. In Alonso de Santa Cruz's Islario General de Todas las Islas del Mundo, Bermeja appears in the Gulf. That mattered because Santa Cruz was not some stray enthusiast sketching rumors into a margin. He was one of the Spanish crown's cosmographers, working inside a system where maps helped direct navigation, taxation, and imperial control. If his charting tradition placed an island in the Gulf, later mapmakers had reason to trust it, and many did. That is how a doubtful feature becomes dangerous. Not because one person drew it once, but because institutions inherit it, copy it, and quietly grant it authority. Copied is not the same as confirmed. Stand on a ship's deck with 16th century tools, and the weakness appears immediately. No satellite fix, no radar, no aerial verification. Dead reckoning, celestial readings, weather, haze, shoals, and the temptation to turn an uncertain shape into solid land. A low quay glimpsed at distance, a sandbank mistaken for permanence, a position written down wrong once and trusted for generations after. Bermeja may have been real. Bermeja may have been a charting error. Bermeja may have been a temporary feature that vanished while the map outlived it. Every explanation starts with the same problem. Ink is easier to preserve than geography. Around 2000, Mexico and the United States were formalizing maritime boundary arrangements in the Gulf. That is when Bermeja stopped being a niche puzzle from an old atlas and became potentially valuable geography. If the island could be fixed and recognized, it might strengthen Mexico's position over offshore maritime zones and the resources tied to them. If it could not be confirmed, then a possible legal foothold dissolved. The question was no longer just whether a forgotten island had existed. It was whether Mexico was negotiating from the strongest geographic case available or from a map history that could not survive contact with the sea. Oil has a way of making historical uncertainty suddenly expensive. So the burden shifted from old cartographers to modern institutions. This was exactly the kind of case they were supposed to settle. Archives should have narrowed the location. Hydrographic surveys should have tested the seabed. Oceanographic work should have found at least some residue of the old reports. Emergent land, shoals, reef structure, a submerged trace. Anything that could show the maps had once pointed to something physical. Navy can tolerate mystery and folklore. It cannot rely on mystery in a boundary argument. The more capable the institutions were, the more damaging failure became. If they could not verify Bermeja, then the island was not merely elusive. It was collapsing as usable evidence. The search came back empty. No Bermeja at the expected location. No island rising above the Gulf. No clean modern confirmation to rescue the old atlases. And that failure did more than embarrass a line on a chart. If Bermeja could not be demonstrated, then any maritime advantage tied to it weakened with it. A feature that might have helped project Mexican claims farther into the Gulf could no longer do legal work if it could not do geographic work first. In disputes over offshore space, absence is not neutral. It benefits the side that can argue from what is physically there. Officially, that pushes the story toward the least romantic explanation. Phantom Island, cartographic error. A name repeated longer than the thing, if there ever was a thing, deserved. But the timing made that tidy answer hard for many people to accept. Bermeja did not become famous when a 16th-century cosmographer recorded it. It became famous when its existence could affect territory, leverage, and money. If the island had faded from scholarship a century earlier, almost nobody outside map history would have cared. Instead, it seemed to disappear at exactly the moment someone had a reason to need it. That coincidence invited darker theories almost automatically. Secret destruction, political suppression, convenient erasure. None of that is required by the evidence. Public suspicion was never driven by geology alone. It was driven by the cost of not finding the island when finding it might have mattered most. So Bermeja remains suspended between archive and ocean, entered by a royal cosmographer, repeated by later maps, pursued by a modern state, and missing when verification finally carried legal weight. Modern surveys can say what they did not find. They still cannot fully answer the more unsettling question. Did the Gulf conceal a cartographic error for centuries? Or can an island valuable enough to affect maritime claims vanish from reality while continuing to survive in documents? Number 1. The final arc. A missing island can redraw borders for decades. On March 8, 2014, the ocean was handed something far more exact than a map label. It was handed 7 electronic handshakes. At 12:41 a.m., Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370, a Boeing 777-200ER, registered 9M-MRO, lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport for Beijing. On board were 227 passengers and 12 crew. 239 people inside one of the most tracked kinds of machines on Earth. The aircraft climbed into the night, checked in normally, and for a while the route looked routine, north, across the South China Sea, toward China. Then the ordinary record broke in a very modern way. The last normal radio call went out. Civilian radar contact was lost. But the airplane did not vanish into silence. It kept answering, faintly, automatically, through the satellite link. Not voice, not a distress call, a series of hourly pings between the aircraft and an Inmarsat satellite. 7 handshakes after radar contact was gone. Enough to prove the jet was still alive in the system for hours, and enough to show the wrong search zone would drain precious time before anyone realized the aircraft had turned back. That is what made MH370 the case where the whole planet watched the ocean keep one secret. The early clue was there. The answer was not. And because the clue was so thin, every hour spent in the first search area made the eventual hunt harder. The first geography was wrong. Search crews were sent into the South China Sea because that was where a Beijing-bound airliner was supposed to be. But military radar data suggested something else. After contact was lost, the jet had turned back across Malaysia and tracked west toward the Strait of Malacca. The map of the mystery had to be redrawn in real time, not from wreckage, from absence, timing, and a path that cost the search its first crucial days. Start with the aircraft. A wide-body jet built to cross oceans. Start with the route. Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, one of the most ordinary overnight corridors in Asia. Start with the break. A filed path north, but an actual path bending back across a peninsula in darkness. Then add the handshakes. Each one gave investigators a distance arc from the satellite, not a clean position. So instead of a point, they got a ring. Then another. Then another. A narrowing geometry built from timing data and Doppler analysis, cold and precise, but also creating multiple false graves across the map before one southern corridor seemed likeliest. By March 17, 2014, the logic of those numbers had pushed the hunt thousands of miles from the original search zone. Australia accepted responsibility for the underwater search in the southern Indian Ocean. An airliner had not vanished near a crowded route. It had apparently flown on into one of the most remote stretches of water on Earth, where each kilometer searched was another kilometer's survival time could not be recovered. You can feel the scale of that change. You go from coastal seas and shipping lanes to a search area measured not in harbors, but in vast, empty bands of ocean. Aircraft scan the surface. Ships drag instruments across seafloor terrain no passenger ever sees, and few people can picture. The search continued for years. October 3, 2017, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau published the operational search for MH370 and ended its formal search roll. That official endpoint confirmed the search had exhausted its tools, but it also left investigators and families with a harsher reality. The airplane could still be out there, beyond the scanned seabed, carrying evidence no one had been able to reach. And yet the ocean did not give back nothing. Pieces began appearing far from the disappearance point, washed ashore in the western Indian Ocean. Debris confirmed and assessed as likely from MH370 turned up on coasts and islands separated by currents, distance, and time. That mattered because it fixed one brutal fact in place. The aircraft did end in the ocean. The search had not chased a phantom. But the debris also complicated the story. It proved the crash while making intent harder to prove, because wreckage can show impact without revealing who made the final decisions. So the numbers became stranger, not cleaner. 239 people. Years of multinational searching. Confirmed debris. A known diversion from the filed route. A final official Malaysian safety report on July 2, 2018. That report closed the formal investigation without answering the hardest question. Who was responsible for the diversion, and what exactly happened in the cockpit during the final hours? Emotionally, it meant no family received the one truth that could be grieved. Investigatively, it meant the case remained open in all the ways that matter. The handshakes narrowed the airplane to a remote southern arc. They pointed search ships into the right ocean, to explain why debris later washed ashore where it did. But they could not name the final descent point on the seafloor. The corridor was there, the grave was still hidden. And without the main wreckage, the flight data recorder, and the cockpit voice recorder, the last minute could still overturn the entire official story.